There are some things in life that really do make sense. Last year on vacation, I read a book about Jack the Ripper. I was sitting at the pool and at the beach wearing creepy dark sunglasses, reading a book about a serial killer, and I couldn't understand why people didn't want to talk with me. But then I thought about it, and frankly, that makes sense. This year, I read a book about Arnold Palmer and found people to be much more engaging. Some things make sense, but some things just don't make sense. Lori and I took a vacation, as you know, and yes, she did purchase some bracelets. The ushers will be at the door to receive an offering to help with my cause. But on this vacation, and this seems to happen now every year, I'm on the beach, I'm minding my own business. Last year I was reading about Jack the Ripper. This year I'm reading my Arnold Palmer book, and a guy comes up and says, "Hey, Poppy, you need some weed?" Every year I'm asked to buy marijuana. This year I was asked to buy marijuana more than once. The second guy then wants to talk about his marijuana and how he smokes weed literally every single day. So let me ask you, do I look like a pothead? And if you answer in the affirmative, please don't say it audibly, okay? Now, granted, I wouldn't necessarily expect this guy to peg me as a preacher, but a pothead? Really? He said, "I got a good stash, amigo." And frankly, I believe him. But I kept thinking, why me? I mean, I have cufflinks to go along with my starched swimming trunks. Some things just don't make sense. The text that we're going to look at this morning is like that. It's going to perhaps stretch the limits for us as far as making sense, but I think once we understand it embodies an awesome concept, it will make sense. In the next few weeks, I think I'm going to do a mini-series about marriage and family, kind of a review of some of the basics together, so we're all reminded of some very important things. But for today, we're going to continue with our 3,097th installment of our series in Matthew's Gospel. The possibility of the impossible. The possibility of the impossible. Matthew chapter 17, beginning with the 14th verse, will serve as our text, and I'll invite you to stand for the reading of God's Word. And when they came to the crowd, a man came up to him and kneeling before him said, "Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is an epileptic and he suffers terribly. For often he falls into the fire and often the water. And I brought him to your disciples, and they could not heal him." And Jesus answered, "O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him here to me." And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the boy was healed instantly. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, "Why could we not cast it out?" And he said to them, "Because of your little faith. For truly I say to you, if you have faith like a grain of mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you." Thank you so much. You may be seated. The possibility of the impossible. Most of the things that I have read about this text through the years have centered on the idea of faith. And frankly, as we read the text, that makes sense to me, and I understand that. And we're going to do the same thing eventually, but not without first noting something that puts the idea of faith into what I would say would be a proper perspective. So let me take you down a quick detour first. Faith is important. Jesus is most important. Faith is important. Jesus is most important. We humans have the natural tendency to make a big deal out of something, maybe even something that's good, while neglecting something that is even a bigger deal. Let me explain. If you go today, or probably not today, but at some point this week, you go to the Christian bookstore, or maybe you go home and you peruse the religious section of Amazon, or maybe you go home and you turn on and you're watching religious television stations, you'll find a big emphasis on faith, you'll find a big emphasis on prosperity, you'll find a big emphasis on health and wealth and so forth. You can go to a Christian bookstore and you'll find all kinds of books about finances, about parenting, about busyness, about entrepreneurship, about Christian biographies, and you'll even find a section probably about so-called Christian celebrities. You'll find books on self-help, you'll find books on heaven, and even heretical books about little boys going to heaven and then coming back. What you won't find a big emphasis on is Jesus. And frankly, that's just wrong. Now, let me be clear. Of course, faith matters. It's a big deal. Of course, prosperity, properly understood in the spiritual context, matters. Of course, health matters, and heaven matters, and parenting matters, and so on. But what matters the most, and please don't miss this, what matters the most is that we understand who Jesus is, what He has done, what He is doing, and what He will one day do, and how that affects our life here and now, as well as how that affects us for all of eternity. Can I get a witness? So what did He do? What did Jesus do? Jesus was born of a virgin. He lived a perfect, sinless life. He died on a cross as a perfect substitute for the sins of the whole world. He was buried in a borrowed tomb and He was resurrected. That is, He conquered death. That's what He did. Right now, Jesus is at the right hand of God the Father, interceding on our behalf. That's what He's doing. One day He will return in glory again to the earth. The dead will be raised, and Christ will judge all humankind in righteousness. The unrighteous will be consigned to a terrible place called hell, and the righteous will be taken to dwell forever in heaven. That's what He's going to do. And listen to me, that's the big deal. Now, in the text at hand, we read about something that most people in our so-called sophisticated culture don't even believe anymore. I mean, for example, when's the last time you had a conversation, a serious conversation with somebody about demons while you were sober? It's a stretch, I know, to go from the world today into the biblical world, but in order to understand this, we have to do this. We have to be reminded today there is more to life than what science has proven thus far, or what they may even prove someday for that matter. That is not, let me be clear, that is not anti-science. But remember, we walk by faith, not blind faith, by the way, but we walk by faith, not by sight. Science does not have to prove something in order for me to believe it. Science hasn't proven the resurrection, but I believe, don't you? Think of how warped our culture is in this regard. I mean, they think we're crazy to believe that a dead carpenter got up and walked out of a tomb. They think we're crazy to believe that demons actually exist. But remember, these are the very same people who think it's normal for the FBI to hire a psychic to catch a serial killer. And they think it's normal for a housewife to be a practicing Wiccan on the weekends, and it's normal to think Lady Gaga is normal. So, we recognize Jesus as being of primary importance. We know He was fully God and He was fully man. And in this account, we see something to both aspects of His being. As to His deity, we see Jesus healing. As to His humanity, we see the great compassion that Jesus exhibits. As G. Walter Hansen notes, The gospel writers paint their portraits of Jesus using a kaleidoscope of brilliant emotional colors. Jesus felt compassion. He was angry, indignant, and consumed with zeal. He was troubled, greatly distressed, very sorrowful, depressed, deeply moved and grieved. He sighed, he wept and sobbed. He groaned. He was in agony. He was surprised and amazed. He rejoiced very greatly and was full of joy. He greatly desired and he loved. Just a few weeks ago, before I had to take Lori to buy more bracelets, we spent 2 weeks talking about the Transfiguration, studying that. Remember what happened to Jesus, and remember how his disciples, some of them witnessed that on the mountain. As Frederick Dale Bruner wrote, at the top of the mountain, Jesus had shone and glowed. At the foot of the mountain, he moans and groans. There we saw his deity, here his humanity. Matthew sets up this miracle beautifully. In verse 16, he notes how the disciples could not heal the boy. Remember, 3 disciples had gone up the mountain with Jesus, so 9 are down at the base of the mountain, and of the 9, not one single disciple could successfully battle this demon. And then in verse 19, the same reality is repeated. They could not cast out the demon from this child. Now, in both places, the word used for they could, and of course we know Matthew will add that phrase or that word not, they could not, but the word used for they could comes from the word we use for dynamite, that is dynamis in Greek. In other words, they could not do it. They did not have the power. Their best proverbial dynamite didn't work. And then cue the music as the camera pans to Jesus and he rebukes the demon and the boy is healed instantly. Nothing, as Jesus will remind us, as recorded in verse 20, nothing is impossible with God. The word impossible comes from the same Greek root for unable. Remember, dynamis. The difference is Jesus has the power. Where there is inability, Jesus has ability. He is able. He is the proverbial power. He is, in fact, the dynamite necessary to make the difference. So now, all of that aside, we're going to talk about faith, but not like we so often hear it. I am not going to tell you that your faith will make you rich. It may make you have more friends for a while, but it won't make you rich. I'm not going to talk about faith in the context of being successful or having your so-called best life now. I'm not even going to talk about faith in the way that some people think it's going to take faith to renovate a worship center. As an aside, let me just say this. It has always bugged me how too often in the church, the only thing preachers try to connect faith with is building a building. Have you ever noticed that? Like preachers, when they want to talk about faith, they talk about building a building. Now, I think that's just wrong, and I don't want to sound condescending. I just returned from vacation, and I'm in a relatively good mood. So let's not change that, okay? And I'm hopeful that you missed us like we missed you. But listen, it's not going to take faith to renovate this building. I'm not being crass when I say that. It's not going to take faith to renovate this building. It's a spiritual thing to do, as I note in my article. Don't read it now, or your name will appear on the screen. It's a good thing to do, but it doesn't take great faith for 500 or 600 people to pay for the equivalent of the mortgage for 3 or 4 or maybe 5 families. It's going to take some money, but not necessarily a lot of faith. Frankly, there's enough money available among us to get the renovation paid off in short order. It's really not that big a stretch. If the average home in Kearney alone, just this area right here, the average home in Kearney alone is some $200,000, which is actually more than that, as you probably know. And let's say, for the sake of example, that it's going to cost us $1 million to $1.2 million to renovate this worship center. That's like 5 or 6 mortgages with no money down, and there are some 600 of us, which is 595 more than the 5. It's going to take some sacrificial giving, but not necessarily a big stretch of our faith. Right? Now, some of you didn't get that, and you're going to be talking about me at lunch. Take a number. Listen to me, I know $1 million is a lot of money. I get that. But it's not astronomical in light of the provision God has given to a group this size. Does that make sense? So my point is, when we talk about faith, as a church, we've got to talk about more than buildings. That's not what faith is all about. We'll talk more about it later. So the detour. Faith is important, but Jesus is most important. So let's dig in. Number one, there are people with no faith. There are people with no faith. Verse 17 back in our text. And Jesus answered, O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him here to me. I'm not an expert at condescension, and I'm not an expert at rebuke, but I'm pretty sure that's what's going on here. There are people with no faith, and we know what that looks like from this account. It's the scribes and the Pharisees standing off in the distance. But if I can sound preachy for just a moment, and you know I can, it's also the people who claim to follow Jesus and yet ignore His word like the scribes and the Pharisees so often did. Look, we have all read what Jesus said about the way being narrow. You guys read that? Two of us? You guys have read that about the way being narrow. All right. The older I get, the more narrow I think it is. Here's what I mean. It just doesn't make any sense to say you're a believer, but then go through life and never bear any spiritual fruit, or for that matter, never want to. That's not the narrow way. That's the wrong way. The people today who fill a lot of mainline churches don't have biblical faith. They're not on the narrow way. They're on the wrong way. I read not long ago about a former Southern Baptist church, key word there being former, they're not among us anymore, a former Southern Baptist church in Washington, D.C., a very historic church that called two married lesbians to co-pastor the church. Now you think you people have it bad. And the people who called these ladies to pastor their church, listen to me carefully, I'm not being ugly, they don't have biblical faith. The people that called two practicing lesbians married to one another to pastor their church, they don't have biblical faith. If they did, they would know what the Bible says about pastoring and sexuality. I'm not being unkind, but I'm being truthful. I can't tell you how many people that I have known in my lifetime or encountered in my life that have spent a little bit of time in church, or maybe they registered for Vacation Bible School 1 week, or at some point they signed on the dotted line, maybe they walked an aisle, maybe they were even baptized, and then they have lived like a child of hell for the last decades of their life, and when the time comes for you to read their obituary, you would think you were reading about the fourth person of the Trinity. Like somebody said years ago, we spend all week sowing our wild oats and come to church on Sunday praying for crop failure. Listen, guys, that doesn't make sense. It doesn't. Listen, the way is narrow. In fact, I think it's narrower than a lot of people want to believe. Now, please understand, God is a God of grace. God is a God of grace, but you've got to be open to His grace. You've got to receive His grace. And when you do, while you won't be perfect, and you'll still mess up, you'll still make mistakes, and in fact, you'll still sin, there is something that changes on the inside. Isn't that true? Something changes. And just one more thought while we're here, because you're not going anywhere yet, right? Notice the act of faith that we see here in the story. It's recorded in verse 15 when the daddy says, Lord, have mercy on my son. Now, we're going to talk about this in a moment, but here, Matthew doesn't mention prayer. He shows it. He shows the dad talking to Jesus, and prayer, after all, is what? People talking to God. So please notice this. This is not, by the way, just some kind of generic prayer. This is the kind of prayer, this is not the kind of prayer that is still mostly acceptable in places around the globe these days. This is not a pause and someone saying, now please, let's have a moment of silence. for you to talk to the God of your personal preference. No, this is a man talking to Jesus. The way is narrow. And you may call me judgmental, but it would be spiritual malpractice for me not to tell you the truth about this. The Muslims have it wrong. The Jehovah's Witnesses have it wrong. The Mormons have it wrong. The Catholics who talk to Mary and pray to other saints have it wrong. The Buddhists have it wrong. The people who understand Jesus is the only way, narrow as He is, that's the only ones that have it right. Not because they or we are better, but because we're coming to God on the terms that He calls us to come to Him with. So there are people with no faith. Secondly, not only there are people with no faith, there are people with little faith. Verse 19 and then verse 20, part A. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, "Why could we not cast it out?" He said to them, "Because of your little faith." There are people with little faith. Now, I've been there and done this, and you have too. And the rest of you that say you haven't, you're probably lying. Amen? But for the moment, I'm not talking about little faith in the quantitative sense. I'm not talking about the amount of faith, but rather the substance of faith, the object of faith. Little faith, this is the problem, little faith is not directed to Jesus, and little faith is not humble before Jesus. Notice the scene. The disciples are talking to Jesus, and they say, "Why couldn't we cast this out?" And Jesus says, "Because of your little faith." Why could we not cast it out? As some writers have noted, it seems likely the disciples had a good bit of faith, but faith in themselves. Now, don't be dismayed about this, but this portion of Scripture contains what's known as a textual variant. What it means is that some translations, for example, like the King James Version, will say something like this. It will say, "Howbeit, this kind goeth not out but by prayer and fasting." Modern translations don't contain that. They don't contain what is verse 21. If you have a newer translation, you'll notice it goes from verse 20 to verse 22. And you say, "Whoa, what was in my coffee this morning that would make me not see that?" It's because the earliest and best Greek manuscripts discovered in the last 400 years don't have that. So it's likely, I can't prove it, but it's likely that a very pious monk copying Matthew put this phrase in about prayer because that's how Mark's version ends. This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer, Mark chapter 9, verse 29. And then the monk probably said something about fasting because medieval monks liked to fast. Obviously, he was not a Baptist. So maybe the disciples thought, "Hey, wait a minute. We've been with Jesus. We know what He's all about. We've been listening to Him teach. We get it. I'm sure that we can cast out this demon, but something is missing here according to Jesus." They have little faith at this point. Perhaps, as some have noted, this little faith is not directed to Jesus, and little faith is not humble before Jesus. Little faith is the kind of faith that seems to think it can get it done on its own. You know how we do this. Jesus, I've got this. If I need your help, I'll call. Or you know how this works too. Man, I've tried everything else. When all else fails, I guess we'll pray. The disciples are saying something probably like, "We can cast this demon out, right?" Little faith is a cheap substitute for the real thing. And there's nothing at all quite like the real thing. Do you guys like guacamole? Okay? Now, if more of you don't, this illustration won't work, so work with me here, okay? Guacamole. Lori loves guacamole. She washed that dress in guacamole. So I'm going to hear about that one, I know. Not from her, but from you guys. So we're at a restaurant in Mexico, and they bring our food. And my dish has this little bitty sort of spoonful of guacamole. It's small, but it's green guacamole. Now, I don't know exactly why they brought this little bitty thing of guacamole, but whatever. So I'm laughing to myself because I know she likes guacamole. You fellas know where I'm going with this? You know, like when you get a dessert and she says, I don't want any, I'll just have a bite of yours. Can I get a witness? In the house of the Lord, can I get a witness? You know what I'm talking about? So anyway, I don't know why they bring this little bit of guacamole, but whatever. So I'm laughing to myself and I'm thinking, she's going to want that. So I thought I would pull one over on her. So just as she looked up, I took that little spoonful of guacamole and I ate the whole thing, one bite, swallowed it with one fell swoop. The problem was, it wasn't guacamole. Are you familiar with wasabi? I was not, but I am now. In fact, I knew immediately. In fact, I knew for the next 4 hours. It wasn't what I thought it was, and wasabi is no substitute for guacamole. Can I get a witness? And listen to me carefully, brothers and sisters. Little faith is no substitute for mustard seed faith, as we'll see in just a moment. So there are people with no faith. There are people with little faith. Finally, there are people with mustard seed faith. Verse 20, He, that is Jesus, said to them, because of your little faith, for truly I say to you, if you have faith like a grain of mustard seed, the smallest seed in his day essentially, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. Nothing will be impossible for you. There are people with mustard seed faith. Little faith is not directed to Jesus, and little faith is not humble before Jesus, but mustard seed faith is the opposite. It is big on Jesus and not very big on one's self. The father in the story does what? He literally is on his knees, he's kneeling, and he begs for mercy on behalf of his son, and Jesus answers the prayer, and the little boy is healed. The key is the inner posture, the humility, the recognition that he's not God, but Jesus is. Luke, if you've read the account, Luke tells the story, and he tells us that this boy was the man's only child, and in fact his father could hardly leave him for a moment because the boy would convulse and foam at the mouth. This is a very desperate situation, and please, parenthetically, don't try to connect the disease of epilepsy with demon possession. We're dealing with both in this situation, but one doesn't necessarily follow the other. It's a mountain, however, for these men. It's a mountain of a problem, but Jesus says in verse 20 that mountains can be moved, right? And this mountain is moved not by a little faith, but by the power of prayer. The father simply asks Jesus to have mercy on his boy. That's a prayer. As Bruner notes, prayer is simply faith breathing. Prayer is simply faith breathing. Have you been there? Man, I have. Have you ever had to take someone you love to Jesus in prayer? If you can think back to that time when you had no other options but God, and you took your loved one to Him, then you start to get the picture of what's taking place here. It's when we're at the end of ourselves, when we've reached the place we can't do anything else, when all we have is, well, God. That's the picture. Faith is not about building buildings. It's the prayer at 12:15 when your kid was supposed to be in at 11:30 and now you hear sirens. It's the words that you cannot articulate because the strain between you is too great and you feel like your heart is going to explode because you're hurting so badly. It's the prayer that you don't even whisper, but it's in your mind and in your heart at the hospital when the doctor says, we're not sure what we're dealing with here and we really don't know what else to do. It's that moment you turn to God as you realize the pink slip is in the mail and you don't have a plan B. It's the realization that Jesus is all you have. Sean O'Donnell writes the story about the missionary named John Paton. And in 1858, he traveled from his native Scotland to serve the natives of the South Seas. And after Paton had learned enough of the local language, he began to translate the Gospel of John into their tongue so they would be able to read the Bible in their own language. He was puzzled, however, about how to translate one of John's favorite expressions, and that expression is believe in. Believe in, pistio eis in the Greek language, believe in. And so Paton puzzled over this expression because the natives had no specific word in their language for trust, which made absolute perfect sense because they were tribes of cannibals, a group which knew little to nothing about trust, especially trusting one another. But Paton was relieved when his servant, who was a converted native, arrived on the scene and came to his aid. So one day, sitting at his desk, Paton asked him, "What am I doing?" And the man said, "You are sitting at a desk." And Paton then raised both of his feet off the floor and sat back in the chair. "Tell me now, what am I doing? What am I doing now?" And the servant, in his native tongue, used a verb that means, quote, "to lean your whole weight upon." To lean your whole weight upon. That was the precise expression Paton was looking for, and the one he used throughout his gospel translation for the verb believe in. That is, to lean your whole weight upon, to give it everything. Isn't that what we see here with this desperate father? By expecting everything from Jesus and nothing from himself, and by yielding to the sufficiency of Christ, he leans with his whole weight upon Jesus. And in so doing, he becomes a great model for us of genuine faith, a faith that is aware of inadequacies, a faith that takes no confidence in itself, a faith that does not judge Jesus by the weakness of his followers, a faith that looks at the powerful Son of God and him alone, and a faith that quite simply kneels down and says, "Lord, have mercy." Do you have that faith? Do you have that faith? It's not big faith. It's just faith that humbly prays to Jesus for the dynamite to do the difficult, for the power to overcome the impossible. It's the possibility of the impossible. Do you have that faith?